Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace, blessings, and mercy of God be upon you. This is an initial analysis of the verdict on Babri Masjid by the Indian Supreme Court from www.central-mosque.com and from the Humble Heart YouTube channel. The entire judgment is over 1,000 pages long. I have not read it in full. I am going to read it and then we will talk about it. But this is just an initial history of what this masjid was about, what happened, and what has the Indian Supreme Court actually said. Let's begin. So, the Mughal emperor, his name was Zahiruddin Babur. So, in his native language, it's pronounced Babur. In our Urdu, we call it Babar. So it's a very common name. Many people have this name Babar. So that's why colloquially this masjid is just referred to as Babri Masjid. So I will continue to call it Babri Masjid, but historically his name was Babur. Okay, and the masjid was called Baburi Masjid with a U. So he ruled India between 1483 and 1583. And basically, this was the original mosque right here. Original mosque had inscriptions when you entered. This was the inscription when you entered the mosque. This was on the side, and this matched basically what the inscription on the side of the mimbar of the mosque. And basically, this inscription in 1934 read, "By the order of Shah Babar, Amir Mir Baqi built the resting place of angels in 923 Hijrah." So all of this stuff is destroyed after 1992, no longer exists, so could not have been physically handed over to the court as evidence. However, because it was a historical site, it was well surveyed by many archaeological societies and archaeologists, both before the partition of India in 1947 by the British and after the partition of India in 1947. And it was carbon dated, and there's no doubt about it that these inscriptions and the mosques and stuff stood there from the 1500s. There was no doubt about it. The Indian court basically disregarded all of this testimony for a number of reasons, which were completely hollow. Not because it wasn't carbon date proven, but what they said is this inscription reads, "By the order of Shah Babar, Amir Mir Baqi built the resting place of angels 923. The Muslim archaeologist who actually deciphered the script from Persian into English to be submitted to the court, he basically, at various points, he said, this 923 Hijrah of Islamic date actually corresponds to 1528. In other parts of the document, he refers to as 1529. So basically, on a technicality, they said, hang on a second, how can the same year be two different years? If you have any knowledge of Islamic dates and Hijrah, then you know that Islamic calendar is based on moon sighting, so it is possible. And it happens quite a lot when an Islamic date, they give a ballpark Christian day year that it could be 1528 or 1529. So the judge said, hang on, there's a conflict in your analysis. That was number one. Number two, basically, this inscription, which was outside the masjid, the 923 Hijrah inscription, it contradicted with the inscription inside the mimbar, which I believe said 925 or something like that. I'm just quoting from memory. So what they said, hang on, how can the same inscription have two different dates in the same structure? The reason being is the mimbar, the inside the mosque was destroyed by fire and was rebuilt, so maybe they got the year wrong or something like that. However, it was hundreds of years old nevertheless. The second reason is they said that history proves that Babar, this Zahiruddin Babar, he fought the battle of Panipat in this area 10 years after this inscription. So they said, how can the inscription be there when he fought the historical battle 10 years later? That is a completely irrelevant story, because this area could have been occupied by Babur and the battle was fought somewhere else in the close vicinity. That is just a regardless of the point of contradiction of any kind whatsoever. However, the court said they threw out all of this testimony, the inscriptions, the carbon dating, etc., based on these three things that I have just talked about. Then what happened is the Hindus believed that this mosque was built on top of Ram Janambhumi. Janambhumi means it's a site they believe to be the birthplace of the Hindu deity Rama. And this was known at the time of the British. So what the British did is they kind of sectioned off an area of this, not the mosque, but the entire courtyard area, and they gave a specific area for Hindus to worship, and the Muslims continued to use the mosque. And that carried on until 1949, after the independence of India, when a Hindu mob broke into the mosque and actually brought in idols into the mosque. So that was basically a law and order situation. How the Indian government should have responded is remove the idols and carried on with the status quo of what the British established, but they didn't do that. They left the idols in the mosque and they locked down the mosque, and it remained locked until it was destroyed. It carried on like that, and then the extreme right wing Hindu BJP government, it started gaining power towards the end of 1970s, beginning of 1980s. So in 1984, they started this campaign to build the temple by after destroying the mosque. It carried on gaining steam until on December 6, 1992, a mob destroyed this mosque while Indian security forces and paramilitary police stood by and let them do that. So that is the entire history of the mosque from 1523 until December 6, 1992. It stood there. 1949, it was locked. Nevertheless, there's ample evidence that the mosque stood there from the 1500s and so on. Let's proceed about a thing which I want to talk about, the Indian culture. If you travel in particularly in the rural areas of India, what happens is when you come out of the mosque and you're surprised because there are a whole bunch of non-Muslim women standing there with the babies and the children, and what they want to do is they want you to blow on their children for blessings and things like that. Because these are poor people, a lot of times they don't have access to medical care, and what they do is they believed and they've been told by their forefathers that these Muslims are pious because they pray. So, for the sake of blessings and for the sake of getting their children healthy and a healthy life, they let these Muslims blow on them, right? So, it is entirely possible. This exists even today. The Hindus come to Muslim imams in the West, even forget about India, in the West, right? And they want the imams to blow on water, so which verses of the Quran have been recited into, so they can drink and so on. It's the normal culture in India. So it is entirely possible that while this mosque stood there from the 1520s, that the Hindus thought this was an area of blessings, and they actually worshipped in that area somewhere. And the British, when it started in towards the end of the 1860s or something, the British allowed it, and they said, "Fine, you worship in that area, Muslims, you carry on." So that is the one thing I want to talk about, and you can see that in India and in the West quite clearly. Now, when it comes to Supreme Courts, a lot of people think that basically you go to Supreme Court and the judges are there and they're basically, fair, and they're basically unbiased, and they look at the merits of the case and they decide. That's not what happens. The prime example is Donald Trump in America. So basically, what any government that comes, they stack the Supreme Court with judges which are sympathetic to their cause. Again, Donald Trump as an example. So when any legal challenges and stuff go about and it ends up in Supreme Court, the Supreme Court is the highest court of the land of that country. So the judges are already there, which are basically supportive of the government. The five judges which decided this judgment unanimously, by the way, were all appointed to the Indian Supreme Court during the era of this right-wing Hindu government. So there's absolutely no way this judgment could have came out any differently. So you need to understand that. The same thing's happening in Donald Trump. In America, he says something, the courts challenge it, it rises to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court is stacked up with conservative judges which favor Donald Trump, and the judgment gets quashed and comes out in favor of Donald Trump. When it doesn't, then it becomes news. They say, oh, the Supreme Court has issued a judgment against Donald Trump. Wow, that's big news. So anyway, that's exactly what happened. The Supreme Court for decades have been stacked up with judges. Don't get fooled by a Muslim name like Justice Abdul Nazir. Doesn't matter. So basically, you're not going to get that far to be the judge of Indian Supreme Court unless and until you favor the government in some way. This is not an independent bench. If you read BBC's coverage of this news today, it is slightly different to how the Indian media is reporting it. So basically, what the BBC is saying is based on the Archaeological Survey of India findings (ASI). This was awarded to the Hindus. So what is the reality behind it? So basically, the judgment in the court that you can read, it basically said that Archaeological Survey of India found some pillars which are buried underneath the mosque, which had Hindu motif, Hindu writings on it, means that this mosque was built on top of a Hindu mandir. So the history behind this situation is laughingly funny, really. So the director of the Indian Archaeological Survey, BB Lal, who submitted this report of the pillars, it's astounding what his findings and his reports went through. So in around 1975 is when he was given the permission to dig underneath the mosque. So the mosque was, locked up. There was no worship going on, but he was allowed to basically dig and do an archaeological survey. And he reported there was no pillars whatsoever. 1975. Remember that. For the next roughly 15 years, this carried on. Every single one of his report did not have any findings of a Hindu pillars, were Hindu motives, or anything like that whatsoever. This mysteriously changed in October 1990. The same report that he published in October 1990, by the way, it was published in a RSS, right wing Hindu magazine, and this is the first time these pillars are mentioned. That underneath the mosque, there are pillars. For 15 years, there's no report of that whatsoever. What the other engineers and archaeologists have countered is that even if you take his first finding of those pillars are ornamental, they're not load bearing. So, as I said, this is the reason why I mentioned the history of India, that basically it happens until this day the Hindus come to Muslims places of worship and they ask for blessings and stuff. So they're saying it's entirely possible that the ornaments were placed in the outside area of the mosque, but they were most certainly, these pillars were not load bearing according to engineering, meaning there was no structure there whatsoever. These are ornamental. Now, one of the foremost archaeologists of India, Ravindra Narayan Jha, who actually founded modern archaeology and basically analysis of the structure, he undertook an independent study of this area along with Suraj Bhan, Athar Ali, and R.S. Sharma. I'll put his interview in the link. And what he basically said, he completely debunks this theory, and he goes, there was no pillars, there's no absolutely zero evidence of any Hindu structure underneath that mosque. However, the independent investigation of this foremost expert of India was not taken into account by the Supreme Court whatsoever. They went with this pillar theory, which was first published in a right-wing Hindu magazine in October 1990. So the BBC just mentions Archaeological Survey of India, but they conveniently skip all the other details that go with it. Of course, it's the BBC. Let's carry on. So when you read this section of the judgment, this is basically why they gave the decision and awarded this area to the Hindus. This is based on balance of probabilities. They actually say that clearly. So they don't dispute the fact that this mosque was established in 1520s. There's no doubt about it. They don't dispute the fact that it was actually used as a mosque for all these areas. No. What they're basically saying is there's clear evidence to indicate the worship by the Hindus in the outer courtyard continued in spite of setting up a grill brick wall in 1857. So as I said, what the British did when the Hindus said that this was the birthplace of Ram, the British set up a brick wall outside to let the Hindus worship there and let the Muslims continue. What they said, there's balance of probabilities, meaning there's no clear evidence here, but they think there's probability that Hindus worshipped at that wall before 1857. Point number one. There's no evidence, but probability that maybe the Hindus worshipped at that wall outside the mosque before 1857. Now, the mosque was there for 1523, so Muslims have been praying there since 1520s, completely discounted. Secondly, what they said is basically probability that the Hindu worship existed there before the capture of the area by the British. Okay. What they've said in the judgment is Muslims cannot prove that this area was exclusively used for namaz, prayer, salah. So, because the Muslims cannot prove that this area was exclusively and only used for salah, it must have also been used by Hindus, therefore the Hindus get it. It's a laughable judgment, right? And as I said, I'm going to carry on reading the entire 1045 pages and it'll take some time to analyze it. But this is what they're basically saying. They asked the Muslims, okay, prove it that not not just prayer, Muslim namaz or Muslim prayer, but other acts of worships were done there exclusively by Muslims and no other religion, and then you can have the place. And because the Hindus were there, the British set up the wall, and the Hindus came there, and they said no. So that means the entire area belongs to Hindus and not Muslims. So this is a laughable judgment by a biased court which completely disregarded independent archaeological and scientific data. There's zero evidence whatsoever, even in the Archaeological Survey of India, which the BBC is reporting, because when you look at the same study all the way from 1975 to 1990, before it was published in a right-wing Hindu magazine, there's no evidence of any Hindu structure underneath that mosque whatsoever. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.